The Morrison Campus Alternative School in Dallas, Oregon, wasn't Karissa's first high school, but it was the first place that she ever felt truly safe. She enrolled there after a rocky stretch, where she was grieving the passing of her father, navigating addiction recovery, and trying to stabilize her life. Morrison was for kids who were slipping through the cracks, and that's exactly where Karissa had been. But the small classes, patient teachers, and the second chance mindset gave her the structure and support that she really needed. It became more than just a school, it became her second family. She kept in touch with her teachers long after graduation. They watched with pride as she went from barely passing to actually tutoring other students, as she traded chaotic relationships for a focused life plan, and as she started dreaming about something bold and selfless, as she now planned to become a teacher. Karissa was drawn to the kind of students that others overlooked. She knew exactly what it felt like to be judged, what it was like to lose a parent. She wanted to be the calm in the storm for someone else. After graduating from Morrison, Karissa wasted no time in building a better future. She enrolled at Chemiquita Community College, where she juggled coursework with part-time jobs. Her goal was a teaching degree from Western Oregon University. It was never easy, and money was definitely tight. She moved in between roommates, her mother's house, and even slept on couches when she had to. But everything changed in 2016, when she gave birth to her son, William Allen Fretwell II. She named him after her dad, and she called him Billy. At just 22, Karissa became a single mother, and she never looked back. She worked security shifts late into the night, sometimes grabbing only a few hours of sleep, before her college classes started again the next morning. She took on swing shifts at a soy sauce factory in Salem. But as well as that, she volunteered at Morrison to fulfill her school practice hours, and this left her just enough time to study into the night, whilst Billy slept. Every decision she made centered around her son. She chose to pay 6 months of rent up front to avoid housing instability, and she organized her life to make sure that Billy never felt the weight of her struggles. But the struggles were always there, they were just beneath the surface. Childcare alone ate up more than 30% of her income every single month. She had hoped that she'd be able to raise Billy entirely on her own, but by 2018 she knew that she needed help. She filed for support from Michael Wolf, Billy's biological father. Karissa didn't want a relationship with Wolf. In fact, she rarely even mentioned him by name, but she did want her son to have what he deserved. And even more than that, she wanted him to have the chance to know his father, if that father was willing to show up. However, the father fought at every turn. He disputed the support order. He told her to stop being dramatic. But still, Karissa bravely didn't back down. Billy had Karissa's blue eyes, as well as her fierce determination. He was bright, funny, and endlessly active. He loved Elmo, Jack from The Incredibles, and chasing soccer balls across the grassy patches near their apartment complex. Karissa's friends called him a blonde blur. He adored water, any kind, anywhere. Kiddie pools, puddles, the ocean, anything. He would light up on FaceTime calls with relatives. He gave tight, toddler-sized hugs, and wherever he went, he brought joy. Karissa posted online often about her son, photos of him at the coast, sat on her shoulders, holding her hand on an empty road. In one Facebook caption, she shared the words of a Creed song, "You come to me with arms wide open, you rest your head on my shoulder and hold me tight." Billy's bed was shaped like a race car. His toys, Sesame Street figurines and plastic trucks were scattered across their one-bedroom apartment. He and Karissa shared the bedroom closet. However, she gave him the master bedroom, meaning that he could sleep undisturbed, while she worked late into the night on homework. She often spoke with friends about just how exhausted she was, how the weight of parenting, school, and work was almost getting too much. However, one thing she never complained about was Billy. He was her reason for everything. Karissa's friends said that Billy kept her grounded, that he was the light that she clung to when the rest of life started feeling uncertain. Karissa met Michael Wolf the way many people meet regular customers. It was through routine, repetition, and proximity. She was delivering sandwiches for Jimmy John's in McMinnville, and Wolf was a frequent caller. But he didn't just order lunch. Instead, he specifically started asking for Karissa every single time. At first, it might have felt flattering, or well, maybe not. He was an older man. In fact, he was older by more than 2 decades, and he worked in security at Cascade Steel Rolling Mills. He actually helped get Karissa a part-time job there, and that's why she was working security shifts just like his. It's unclear exactly where their relationship turned personal. Karissa kept it pretty private. Unlike other romances that she posted freely about online, she never mentioned Wolf by name. In a private Facebook group for moms, she later shared that she found out that he was in fact married only days after learning that she was pregnant. She ended things with Wolf immediately. She didn't want to be responsible for breaking up his marriage, but by then it was already too late. Billy was on the way. When she told Wolf that she was expecting, he didn't react like her father-to-be. According to friends, he instead offered to pay for an abortion, but Karissa declined. She prepared for life as a single mother, leaning on friends, teachers, and community resources. And Wolf, for his part, sent occasional gifts, but he never spent any real time with Billy. He never contributed financially. He never took on a father's role. But what he did do, though, was linger in Karissa's life. She told friends that Wolf would show up unannounced at her apartment, and that he did in fact have a key, because he once co-signed a lease for that property. Karissa also suspected that Wolf had hired someone to follow her. She thought maybe he was trying to gather evidence to challenge her parenting. She said that he was controlling, that he made her feel uncomfortable, but she never really went too far into detail. Even her closest friends struggled to understand the dynamic of the relationship. It was hard to tell if he had been a secret boyfriend, an occasional hookup, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear, Karissa just didn't trust him, and she did fear what he might try to do next. Karissa had previously done everything she could to avoid involving Wolf in Billy's life, but by 2018 she felt out of options. The cost of raising a child alone, whilst also attending college and working full-time, it all added up to a crushing weight. And while she hesitated at first, she eventually filed a claim in Polk County Circuit Court, requesting child support. Wolf contested it. Firstly, he demanded a DNA test to disprove the claims. However, that backfired, and he was in fact confirmed to be Billy's father. So he then argued that the calculations were unfair, even though the court documents showed his gross monthly income was actually close to $3,800. All of this meant that the legal process dragged out for months. Karissa told her friends that Wolf was sending her creepy messages during that time. That Christmas, he mailed her a package full of toys for Billy, along with a separate box for Karissa. Inside it was lingerie, sweatpants with Juicy printed across the back, and a laminated card promising an intimate favour. Karissa wasn't endeared though, she was disgusted. She wanted him to stop sending gifts or she'd have to tell his wife. He just brushed off these threats though. He told her she was being dramatic, but then came the court order. In April of 2019, a judge ruled that Wolf must pay $904 a month, but just 3 days after the final paperwork was signed, rather than making life better for Karissa and Billy, things got unimaginably worse. May the 13th, 2019 began like any other Monday. Karissa picked Billy up from his babysitter at around 4 p.m, and then they likely went home to their West Salem apartment, with Billy's race car bed, his Sesame Street toys, and the small shared space that was their sanctuary. But that night, something unthinkable happened. At 8:45 p.m, security cameras captured Michael Wolf leaving his post at the steel mill. He got into a golf cart, drove through a tree line, and then disappeared into the night. By 9 p.m. though, his phone was pinging near Karissa's neighborhood. Karissa never arrived for her overnight shift at the soy sauce factory. Additionally, she never contacted anyone, and from that moment forward, neither she nor Billy was ever seen again. By 2:45 a.m, Wolf was back at Cascade Steel, caught on camera carrying a white trash bag, This was instead of his usual backpack. His mobile phone records showed that he returned to his home in Gaston by 4:30 a.m. The very next day, Karissa's phone sent a strange text from near Wolf's property. Police refused to release the details of that message, nor will they share who it was sent to, but from then on, Karissa's trail fell silent. On May the 17th, a concerned relative went to Karissa's apartment, and she found the front door was unlocked. The television was still playing, her glasses, wallet, and both cars were still there. Nothing made sense. Salem police opened a missing persons case, one that would quickly turn into a full-blown manhunt.
Now, a week and a half since they went missing, her friends fear that the father of Fretwell's child had something to do with it.
I know they had some problems because he was married, and she was a little scared of him because after she got pregnant, he did threaten her at one time.
There was yelling, screaming. We heard the child crying. We heard saying, "Get away."
She says her husband and other neighbors called police.
Did you hear anything specific about what was being said?
Just said, "Get out, get out." That's all I heard. But we could hear a kid crying. So to us, that's, a thing to call on. I would say it was violent, screaming.
And you heard a man's voice?
Mm-hmm.
And multiple neighbors recall hearing several arguments between Fretwell and a man, including one fight a couple of months ago where police were called.
Wolf was questioned and he denied any involvement. He said that he hadn't seen Karissa since a child support hearing in April. And he said that he hadn't been to Salem in over a year. But as we know, the cell data and surveillance told another story.
At a vigil Monday night, friends, community members, even strangers came together for a mom and son who've become near and dear to them.
I am hopeful, very much.
Mikkel Moats organized the gathering. She says it's not a memorial for Karissa and Billy. It's the opposite, a show of support for their safe return.
We're trying to remind people that we're still out here looking, we're still hopeful, we're still looking for answers, and that it's just important that anybody that has any information to come forward, no matter how small or big that it may seem.
Investigators traced Wolf's movements, they gathered search warrants, and listed him as a person of interest. A week after the disappearance, he was arrested outside a donut shop in Portland. Witnesses said that he made strange comments to female employees.
I would never guessed. I met him a couple weeks ago. He was quiet, nice. There wasn't anything odd. It was just a neighbor saying hi and has a dog.
I don't know. It's just odd. It's just, you see it on the news all the time of somewhere else or a different place, and then next thing you know, it's just right next door. So it kind of makes you wonder.
Following a search warrant, police said that they found substances on his property that were capable of sedating a human being. They also found rope and tarps, items that were purchased just after Karissa and Billy vanished, and at that time they still both remained missing. And then on the morning of June the 15th, searchers returned to a wooded area near Yamhill Timberland where Wolf had firewood permits and which was close to his fishing spot. And this time they found something. Roughly 800 feet from a previously searched zone, 2 bodies were discovered beneath unnatural debris. They were wrapped in tarps, together. It was Karissa and Billy. Karissa's time on this earth was ended by a single blast to the head, and Billy's cause remains undetermined, but this confirmed that neither one of them would ever be coming home. The years that followed were filled with grief, anger, and endless courtroom delays. Karissa's family, once silenced to protect the case, could now finally begin speaking out. Her mother, Nyla, wore a shirt with both of their faces on it. It read, "Gone but not forgotten," as she stood before Wolf in court. She loved that little boy so much, she said. The courtroom was packed with investigators, prosecutors, and family members who'd waited for over 3 years for this day. The legal journey had been exhausting, dragged out by appeals, new laws, and technicalities. For Karissa's sister, Katrina, the sentence didn't bring her any peace. She read her victim impact statement through tears, her voice trembling as she told Wolf, "You put a dollar amount on 2 lives." She shared how her own young son, when asked in class what he wished for, he didn't wish for toys or games, he just wanted his aunt and cousin back. Wolf sat in a suit, almost entirely obscured behind his attorneys. He didn't speak, nor did he apologize. He just blinked and looked shaken as his sentence was read. He received life in prison, with no parole for 30 years. By that time, he'll be in his 80s. Wolf's defense had fought over whether the death penalty could be applied, but in the end, his guilty plea took that option off the table. As Wolf was led out of court, he paused briefly at a collage of Karissa and Billy. He looked at their photos, the woman that he had seemingly groomed, the son that he had never raised, and then he walked on. For 6 years, Anthony Goodwin and Harry Messenger lived just a few steps apart in the small cul-de-sac of Crispin Close in Faversham, UK. Their friendship, at least on the surface, seemed easy. Neighbours would often see them laughing together, sharing drinks, or cooking meals in each other's homes. The two men were in their 60s and 70s. Both of them had once lived rougher lives, but those days now seemed long past. Harry had a serious criminal record tied to substance trafficking, and Anthony had a long string of offences from his younger days, and these included violent offences, but he hadn't done anything like that in more than 40 years. Their bond was built on familiarity, long conversations, and of course a shared fondness for alcohol. But this friendship wasn't as simple as it looked. Neighbours also recalled heated arguments between the two men. One neighbour even remembered seeing Anthony behaving aggressively, and he was aiming this towards Harry just weeks before the events in this video. Both of the men were known to drink heavily, and when the drinks started flowing too freely, tensions sometimes started to build. On May the 18th, 2023, those tensions would explode into something that could never be undone. That night, Anthony spent several hours drinking at the Brent's Tavern, before then heading over to Harry's bungalow. Harry, for his part, was also already well into the night of drinking. By later testing, he was found to have consumed the equivalent of 2 bottles of red wine plus vodka chasers, and he'd also taken tramadol. Neither of the men were in a state to handle a disagreement. At first, it was just words. It was a drunken argument, sparked by something that Harry said about an airplane. Anthony later described it as something silly. Yet somehow, in their intoxicated state, it escalated with shocking speed. According to Anthony's own version of events, Harry suddenly became agitated. He then claimed that Harry, normally calm, charged at him like a bull and began striking him with his fists. Moments later, Harry allegedly produced a hammer, a tool that he kept in a drawer in his kitchen. Anthony said he wrestled it away, and, now in fear for his life, he struck Harry back. At just after 3:30 a.m, neighbours said that they heard 3 heavy bangs echoing from Harry's bungalow, and then there was silence. What Anthony did next, instead of calling for help, was he left Harry laying on the floor. He then returned to his own home across the cul-de-sac. There he washed his clothes, and he got changed into clean ones. And then as dawn broke, he casually walked back to Harry's home. He started ringing the doorbell, and he was trying to call Harry on his mobile phone, acting as if nothing had really happened. However, witnesses described his behaviour that morning as strange, saying it was almost performative. What Anthony didn't realise at the time is that he was actually leaving a trail, and it would answer some tough questions for detectives. At 4:11 a.m, just 40 minutes after neighbours heard those heavy thuds, Anthony sent a chilling text to his brother. It said, "No, I just murdered someone." Still though, at this time, with Anthony believing what he believed, he made no attempt to call emergency services. It is possible that Harry could have been saved if he had. Instead though, he waited. He just wandered back and forth between his bungalow and Harry's, and he continued to make half-hearted attempts to contact him. In fact, it wasn't until nearly 12 hours later, on the afternoon of May the 19th, that Anthony finally dialed 999. The call was recorded, and it painted a disturbing picture. Anthony spoke slowly. He was almost nonchalant, and this is part of that call.
Can police lose your emergency? Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Goodwin. I was over my friend's house last night, a neighbour of mine, and we got into a bit of a dispute. I'm trying to ring him, and I'm getting no answer. We did have a bit of a quarrel over there, you know.
So what is your concern? What have you called the emergency line for?
Yeah, I think I'm on arguing with ran up.
Oh, so are you calling to report the fight?
No, I'm not. He's not responding because I hurt him, you know.
Okay, what's his name?
Harry Messenger.
He admitted to hitting Harry in the head with a hammer. However, he still insisted that it was done in self-defense. Throughout the call, you may have realized that he minimized the severity of what had happened. There was no urgency in his voice. There was no sense of panic. And there was no sense of fear. By the time paramedics and police finally arrived, Harry Messenger had been gone for many hours. The hammer, still stained with red, was found lying beside his lifeless body. And Anthony's story, a story of a desperate struggle for survival, would soon be put under the microscope. From the moment that investigators entered Harry's home, the scene told a story far different from Anthony's claims. The hammer that lay beside him was soaked in DNA and covered in tissue. There were no signs of a major struggle anywhere else in the house. There was no smashed furniture, no broken glasses, no overturned tables. In fact, nothing that would normally suggest a wild brawl. Instead, the scene looked quite clinical. It was targeted and deliberate. Harry's injuries were devastating. The forensic pathologist catalogued no fewer than 18 blunt force injuries located on Harry's head, face and neck. In fact, his skull had caved inward in multiple places. It said his face was fractured beyond recognition. His ear had nearly been torn from his head. And on top of all this, the claw end of the hammer had been used to deliver 13 blows to Harry's chest. The tightly packed markings showed a focused rage rather than a panicked defense. Anthony, by contrast, showed only minor facial bruises and scratches. He had no broken bones. There was no internal injuries, no wounds consistent with being repeatedly attacked with a hammer. Detective Inspector Ivan Beasley, the man who led the investigation, later said the multiple wounds found on the victim, including the fatal wound to his head, inflicted by such a weapon as a hammer, proved that Anthony Goodwin intended to kill Harry Messenger. Combined with Anthony's behaviour after the attack, the washing of his clothes, the text he sent to his brother, and the delay in calling 999, all of this evidence painted a devastating portrait. This was simply murder, and soon a jury would be asked to weigh Goodwin's story against the grim and undeniable facts. Anthony Goodwin's trial began at Maidstone's Crown Court later that year. From the beginning, his defence was clear. He still insisted that he had acted only to protect himself. He described Harry as flying into a sudden rage, claiming that he had been attacked without warning, that he'd been punched and then threatened with a hammer. The judge, Jeremy Carey, rejected Anthony's version of events outright. "I am satisfied you could have left his home at any point, even when he had the hammer in his hand," the judge told him. Continuing, "You stayed because you were angry with him." Evidence from a neighbour, Shannon Gibson, further undermined Goodwin's case. She described seeing him act aggressively towards Harry just 2 weeks before the event. Both of the men, it seemed, were known to drink heavily, and sometimes they would clash when intoxicated. The jury deliberated for over 6.5 hours, and when they returned, their verdict was clear. Anthony Goodwin was guilty of murder. He showed little visible reaction as the decision was read out. This man, who had once shared drinks and laughter with Harry Messenger, would now share a prison cell with a stranger instead. And this friendship that had begun so easily somehow managed to end in the worst way imaginable. On sentencing day, Judge Carey addressed Anthony Goodwin directly. He described the attack as one carried out with great brutality, and said that it was fueled by alcohol. He acknowledged that both men did have criminal pasts, but he also emphasized that neither man had committed any violent offenses for several decades. That night, the judge said that the two men had simply lost their tempers and that it was over something relatively trivial. But what mattered now was the irreversible outcome. Harry Messenger, a father and grandfather, a man deeply loved by his family, was gone, and Anthony Goodwin would live with the consequences for the rest of his life. The judge imposed a life sentence, with a minimum term of 13 years, before the man could even apply for parole. Goodwin remained mostly silent as he was led away. Outside the courtroom, Detective Inspector Ivan Beasley offered words of comfort to Harry's grieving family. "I hope this verdict is of some comfort to the victim's family and friends." For the other residents of Crispin Close, the sense of safety and familiarity they once knew had now been forever shattered. One argument, one moment of uncontrolled rage had destroyed not just a life, but an entire family and a community's peace. The small white hatchback lay crumpled against a lamppost. Its roof was crushed and its wheels still spinning in the air. Police bodycam footage captures a sobbing woman slumped in the back of a patrol car. Her voice, trembling and panicked, breaks the grim silence. "Who's dead? Please tell me who's dead." Long before the night that Truman Hub lost his life, Karla Dodds had already survived a tragedy behind the wheel. As a teenager, she'd been a passenger in a fatal crash, one that should have been a wake-up call. After witnessing firsthand how quickly life can just be snatched away, how the reckless choices of others can shatter families, this should have left a lasting impression, but it didn't. Friends and family had hoped that the earlier accident would be enough to change her mindset. Instead, it seemed to fade into the background of Karla's fast-moving social life. The lessons that she could have learned about the value of caution, about responsibility, and just how precious life is, all of them were ignored. By 2022, Karla was a 25-year-old barmaid living in Whitley Bay. Popular, lively, and known for her infectious energy, she loved nights out, live music, and big groups of friends. She was the life of the party, but sometimes, and often, the life of the party teeters on the edge of disaster. As one former friend would later say, she always thought she could handle it, no matter what she drank, no matter how reckless a situation seemed, she thought she was invincible. When Karla climbed into her Hyundai i10 on that cold November night, she had already crossed several invisible lines. She just didn't know that this time there would be no coming back. That night had started innocently enough. Karla finished her shift at a bar in Whitley Bay, where she'd been pulling pints and laughing with regulars. But when her shift ended, the real party began. She headed to a local nightclub where the drinks kept on flowing. Karla would later claim that she only had 2 glasses of wine and 2 tequila shots that night. But witnesses remembered things very differently. They described her as lively, flushed, loud, and unmistakably intoxicated. Sometime after midnight, a plan was made. There was another party happening and it was just a short drive away, and Karla, full of bravado, offered to drive. Friends piled into the car, and it wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous from the start. As the vehicle wasn't meant to carry 6 passengers, one person squeezed into the boot, and 4 others crammed across the back seat, knees pressed against the windows. Still, the mood inside the car was electric. Music blasted, people sang at the top of their lungs, and Truman Hub, just 22 years old, was laughing along with the others. At one point, he leaned his head out of the rear window, feeling the cold night air whip against his face. No one inside that packed car seemed to realize just how close they were to disaster, at least not yet. The Hyundai sped through the dark streets of North Tyneside. It was weaving between lanes. Karla pressed harder on the accelerator. She was laughing along with singing and barely glancing at the road. In the front seat, a friend shouted over the noise, "Slow down," but Karla didn't. Behind the wheel, her judgment was clouded. She was impaired, distracted, and trying to keep up with the chaotic energy around her. The heavy weight of too many passengers shifted the car's balance, and this made every sudden movement even riskier. The road that they were on, the A191, wasn't particularly challenging. But at high speeds, even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Up ahead, a slight bend approached, and Karla didn't react in time. The car clipped the curb, and then, almost in slow motion, it veered into a lamppost. The impact was devastating. The tiny car flipped onto its side, with metal screeching and glass shattering. Inside, screams filled the air, then were cut short. Truman Hub, the young man who had been smiling just moments earlier, suffered catastrophic injuries. Within just seconds, the laughter and singing had been replaced by sirens, gasps, and a stunned silence. But even as her friends lay trapped and broken, Karla made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She ran. When emergency services arrived at the A191, they found a scene that was almost too chaotic to process. The small white car was mangled beyond recognition. Debris was scattered across the road, illuminated by flashing blue lights. Inside the wreck, Truman was discovered amongst the crumpled seats. Despite desperate attempts to save him, his injuries were far too severe. He was pronounced at the scene. And to add to the tragedy, Truman hadn't even made it to the new chapter that he'd been so close to starting. Recently diagnosed with autism and ADHD, he'd been weeks away from receiving medication that promised him a clearer, easier path forward. His family had been excited and hopeful, but that night ended all of those dreams. Rosalind Hub, Truman's mother, would later describe that moment as the beginning of the most horrific journey of her life. A journey filled with endless grief, sleepless nights, and a silence where Truman's laughter once lived. Life is unbearable, she said in her victim impact statement. I try to get through each day, but my heart is dead like Truman's. Meanwhile, officers at the scene noticed something odd. The driver, the one person who should have been checking in on the injured, was nowhere to be found. In the critical minutes after the crash, Karla made a series of split-second decisions, and none of them were about helping anyone other than herself, and none of them were about taking responsibility. Stumbling away from the wreckage in the early morning darkness, she left Truman and the others behind. Witnesses later described seeing a woman sprinting from the scene, looking panicked and disorientated. Police tracked her down quickly. When they caught up with her, she was sobbing, swaying on her feet and visibly intoxicated. The body cam footage from that moment would become infamous, and here it is.
02, were you 28, okay? I'm arresting you on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving, okay, and causing serious injury by dangerous driving, okay? You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence, you're not mentioned. When questioned, anything you do say may be given a later line in the court, okay? Do you understand? Understand that.
A breathalyzer confirmed what officers already suspected, that Karla was nearly twice the legal drink-drive limit. And yet, even as the reality began to sit in, Karla focused on herself. She focused on her own fear, her own fate, and not on Truman, nor on the family who would be forever broken by her actions. And worse still, this would not be the end of Karla's recklessness. While awaiting trial for causing death by dangerous driving, she was caught once again. Pulled over for speeding, she tested positive for smoking a mild substance. Even facing the weight of a young man's demise on her conscience, Karla still continued to show the same disregard for the law and for life. In early 2024, Karla Dodds finally stood trial at Newcastle Crown Court, but she denied causing death by dangerous driving. However, would the jury agree? Throughout the trial, Karla's behaviour drew scrutiny. When she took the stand, Judge Roger Thomas Casey noted that her testimony was filled with self-pity, not with genuine remorse. She left the scene and ran away to do her best to get away with it, the judge remarked. Everything about this case shows self-pity rather than true remorse. The courtroom heard devastating victim impact statements from Truman's family. His mother, Rosalind, described Truman as her sunshine, the youngest of her 3 sons, full of laughter and mischief. She spoke about his struggles with masking his autism and ADHD, and how he had been so close to finding a new sense of peace and normalcy before his life was taken away. Rosalind shared haunting memories, holding her son's clothes in his empty bedroom, waiting in vain for him to walk through the front door, dreams of a future, helping him, supporting him, all obliterated in one moment. She didn't mince her words about Karla either. She called her actions wicked and cowardly. She said forgiveness was impossible. We get a life sentence, Rosalind said. There is a huge hole in our lives that cannot be filled. Defense lawyer James Doyle tried to paint Karla in a kinder light. He described her as a warm-hearted and kindly soul, someone who deeply regretted her actions. But the judge and Truman's family saw it differently. The truth was brutal. A split-second decision had destroyed multiple lives. After just 4 days of evidence, the jury would find her guilty. This is a case of very dangerous driving, with a number of very dangerous features to it, the judge said. He described Karla as highly impaired, and also noted that she had ignored passengers' desperate pleas to slow down. On March 21, 2025, Judge Thomas sentenced Karla Dodds to 12 years in prison. She was also banned from driving for 13 years and 9 months. The sentence brought a small measure of justice, but for Truman's family, no legal result could ever erase the pain of his loss. No sentence could restore the son, the brother, and the friend that they cherished. Outside the courthouse, Sergeant Dave Roberts, the man who led the investigation, spoke plainly. A split-second decision to drive under the influence can ruin countless lives forever, and there is simply no excuse. For Rosalind, Hilton, Miles, and everyone who loved Truman, their journey of grief continues. Every day without him is another reminder of what was stolen that night. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.